Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Liz Owen. I'm the Director of Communications at PFLAG National, coming to you live from Burbank, California, my home. Glad to have you with us today, and as always, really happy to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Jean Marie Navetta, our Director of Learning and Inclusion. Hi, Jean Marie.
Hello, Liz. I'm waving hello to you from Palm Springs, California. And hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for something to talk about again this week. I'm really excited to be here. And, you know, it would be obvious to say this is a very different kind of Pride Month that we're looking at because of everything that's happening around us. And so obviously we talk about things, so we want to talk about that. So we are using a really interesting article from Forbes today, but to get the conversation started, before we even get there, I want to introduce my two colleagues from PFLAG who are going to be joining me for today's conversation. So I would like to introduce Sechelle Brooks, who is our Chapter Engagement Coordinator, and Jamel Dooley, who is our Chapter Services Coordinator. And they're both joining us from DC. So today we are talking about the article Black, Queer, and Too Tired to Be Proud. And it appeared in Forbes. It was written by Ashley Fowlkes. Essentially it talks about the intersection of the identity of being both queer and Black, and then starts a conversation from there. I will tell everybody who's watching, we did a little bit of a pre-meeting the other day to talk about what we were going to talk about. And that meeting alone took a very long time. And the conversation went everywhere. So I'm really excited that we're talking about this. And I'm really grateful to you two for joining me to do this. So let's get started with that conversation. And once again, if you are joining us online and you would like to participate in this, you can certainly chat with us. And if you'd like to get the article and the questions that we're going to be doing, you can go to straightforquality.org/discussion series and download those. So let's go to the first question so I can stop talking and you can start talking. So Sechelle, I'm probably going to ask you to go first and then bring Jamel in on this one.
Sure.
Sure. So the first question that we sort of floated out there was basically, how did the article make you feel? Did it raise issues you hadn't considered? It was just a review of issues you already knew. Why or why not?
After reading the article, it was interesting to me, at least, how the article was written. It was really explained about come as you are. Like, it had that pride feeling, that essence of like pride. If no matter what you decide to do during the month, it's okay. Mm-hmm. It's like it was like a hall pass. It's like, it's okay, just do it. And it really made me start to think about like, why do I celebrate Pride, how I celebrate Pride. And I enjoyed those aspects a lot. It had that, a part of, it was interesting also because I feel like there was a missed opportunity in the article. Kind of to talk about more of the queer side and like why they may be tired and how they intersect. But I really did enjoy the tone. It was very palpable.
I loved it felt a little bit like a hall pass, sort of giving people some permission to feel whatever you're feeling this month. So that's a good place to start. We're going to go even further into this. Jamel, I see that you're waiting.
I kind of feel like the skit from In Living Color, Men on Film, and I'm just like, hated it. This is not my favorite article. So while I agree with Sechelle, I enjoyed the tone, and it was very much like, you know, take the time that you need if you need to sit aside and like I thought that was fine, but the structure of the article I thought was very weak. I said this during our planning meeting, but it reminded me of like what businesses started to do like around when COVID first happened. We got emails from every brand, every store, your cousin from 3 weeks ago. Like everybody felt like they had to say something about COVID. And I felt like this was Forbes' version of that as it pertains to like the protests and Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, et cetera. And so I think they inadvertently like kind of set themselves up for failure because you have a financial magazine speaking about a sociological matter. So the plus side is what Sechelle mentioned, but I thought that overall, so they tried to introduce the topic or ideology of intersectionality, and it was reductionist. Like they gave you a very basic, watered down, I can't even say 101. It was like 001 version of intersectionality, and therefore missed a really big opportunity to educate what I'm assuming is a predominantly male and straight and white audience about what that is and why that's important.
And, when we talked yesterday, this is exactly where our conversation went. And our conversation actually ended up being more about the misunderstanding of intersectionality than anything else. And how I think at this moment, as we look around at what's happening with us, with Black Lives Matter, with the protests that are happening, with the injustices that continue to happen to protesters, the word intersectionality gets used a lot. And, in its most, Jamel, to use your language, watered down version, it seems to come down to people being able to say, well, I'm more than one thing, when in fact, we know that intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, building on work that Indigenous women had done in her 1989 paper, Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Sex. And in the article, it was all about how the judicial system only looked at individuals in light of one characteristic and not multiple identities that they possess, and that it was impossible to come up with valid and accurate judgments if we didn't look at all of the power structures that were affecting individuals. And if you look at Crenshaw, what she wrote, she said it was essentially to make room for advocacy around this. So let's talk a little bit about this. So for the two of you, I'd love to hear you both talk in your own understandings, in everyday understandings, taking it sort of out of the academic. How do you both understand this concept of intersectionality? And do you think that what we are seeing now is reflective of Kimberly Crenshaw's original intent?
Well, I think Jamel nailed it. It's a watered down version of what the initial, from my understanding of what the initial definition of intersectionality was. I believe it was meant to explain how African American women of oppression versus or in comparison to white women. And right now, in the general sense, it's really just looking at like how different identities cross. That's how I feel like how they meet. Where's that X? That's kind of like, I feel like the community and people generally use it these days.
And do you feel that it has sort of taken away some of the power because of that it's not as effective as a tool because we continue to kind of water it down?
There's benefits to both, I would say.
There are. I'm glad you said that.
there is. It's great because when you broaden something, it brings in other layers and you really get to look at it and explore it. But also when you broaden something, you don't pay attention to the nitty gritty details. And it was meant to look at the nuances of work and race relations. And it takes away from that when you add in 6 other layers. Even though as humans, we have a plethora of different layers, but zoning in really helps. So
and not having that conversation about the power structures behind each one of those layers and sometimes how they interchange. Jamel, talk to us about this too, because I know you've been itching to talk about this one.
Well, I mean, you just said one of like the key phrases, like power structures, and so in the original writing, we talk about economics, we talk about class, we talk about money and how that affects Blackness and specifically like how it affects Black women. Forbes is a financial magazine, and I was like, this is a great opportunity to talk about money and how disproportionately Black people are paid less, but like of Black people, women and trans folks are at the bottom. It was just such a missed opportunity. So the answer to the question is no. I don't think it was used in a way that's really reflective of Kimberly Crenshaw. It also took my mind to Patricia Hill Collins in the Matrix of Domination, which would have also given us an opportunity to talk about specifically now like structure. So we talk about like policing, which would have been something great to talk about considering what's happening in the world, or politics, like the study of power and how that is affected. Like there were multiple ways to tweak the article in a way that still would have been, it would have still completed the task that they sought to complete, but also still would have been within the subject matter of the magazine. Mm-hmm. But I think that got lost in the direction that they took it in.
Do you think that there are examples that could have been brought up to do a better illustration for people of what the original intent is? And can either of you talk a little bit about that? What do you think was sort of missed? Because we've talked about there were kind of missed opportunities here, talking about queerness and race, in this case, being Black. Can you give any examples of how this plays out and that in ways that people often miss? So, I mean, the experiences that people are having that they need to navigate, that Black LGBTQ folks need to navigate, that a lot of people are just not even aware of. Can we talk about any examples of that?
Sure. I feel like in the article, there's a quote where it's like individuals are both Black and queer are caught in a vortex of despair and celebration. And I felt like that was a great opportunity. Like in the article, that is said, and then they kind of explain like why Blacks are feeling X, Y, and Z. And I felt like a missed opportunity was really elaborating like the queer aspect of it. It really went into really focused and zoned in on the celebration. And for the audience that they're talking, that this magazine is for, that's going to go over their head. Like, and yeah, that's a point where I really saw that.
Yeah, I just like in the discussion aspect. So like they name a thing. So it's like, okay, like there are people in the world that are both Black and queer, but they never really talk about like the consequences of that. And so this would have been a great opportunity to play. So for example, so imagine, they didn't talk about this, but there are statistics out there that talk about how LGBT folks, especially folks that have no structures of support, have higher incidences of self-harm, homelessness, self-injurious behavior. There's a variety of negative consequences to kind of go along with that. But separate that, then you have Black people that also experience poverty, over-policing, issues of like education, healthcare. So if you take one and add two and put it together, you get a whole separate, just like smorgasbord of issues to overcome. And like we could have talked about it in that aspect, right? But we didn't. It was just like, hey, this is a thing.
I think it's one of those things that I think people want to bring to light. And so, you keep hearing the word mentioned, and yet you don't hear these really good conversations about it, because I think most of us come to intersectionality these days, a lot of, sort of out of academic settings. You hear it in articles like this, and it's sort of, to me, I always have these moments of, I'm really glad that it's being said outside of the circles that we live in. And yet it's really frustrating that some of these more complicated conversations are going on, and they're not going on. They're going on among the same people all the time. One of the interesting things I think the article brought up, and there's been a lot written about this, is the idea that folks who are both Black and queer sometimes feel as though they need to almost choose between which identity they are embracing at either time. Can either one of you talk a little bit about that? Because I think for somebody reading this in the abstract, it does seem very abstract. Could you kind of talk about what that is like and what cost that brings with it?
That's a very good question.
You like when I ask the questions that we do.
Okay, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. So, I mean, it's exactly that. Like, there are so many narratives out there. You can Google and just trip on someone's narrative. But yeah, like a lot of queer people of color, specifically Black queers, feel like they have to pick and choose what version of themselves that they're showing to whom and when. But I think it's many times a consequence of, once again, power structures in society and the way that things are set up. And I mentioned that I don't want to get ahead for question 3, but I guess I'll mention it now. But like we talked about, like Pride, like so many Pride celebrations have been, I don't know if I should say commandeered or marketed towards, or what word we want to put there, but it really focuses on cisgender white gay men. And so like, here I am, Black and gay. I want to celebrate being prideful, and I want to celebrate and do all the fun stuff. But like, why is it that I can't find any locations that want to have multicultural pride festivals? Why do I have to go to a bar and listen to 8 hours of Lady Gaga? Why are we not, uplifting the 101, queer, Black artist. It's just kind of the way that society has shifted over time that, makes it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Seychelle, anything on that? And I just want to quickly remind people, people who are playing along with us and reading along, please, we're looking at your comments, but if you have questions for us, please let us know. Seychelle, anything on that for you, this idea of having to navigate the two identities?
I know I can't hide the fact that I'm Black. It's something you can't hide. But being queer, I'm not originally not coming out to my family. That was an aspect that I could hide or didn't have to express as much. And that also, that played into my relationship with the LGBTQ community. And then to also see how the LGBTQ community deals with race and accepts Blacks. There's a lot of conflict within the community itself. So like right now, you're seeing how these couple movements are all coming together and like the intersectionality of it all. And
can I add something, Seychelle?
Sure.
I'm thinking about my coming out experience, and like one of the falsehoods that I had to like overcome was that like gayness was aligned with whiteness. And I think that like in my own journey of coming out and becoming just like a whole being, like I just had to seek out other resources. Like the first thing that you see, like when you're coming out, like regardless, are once again like gay white men. So the first things that I saw were what, like Cher, Madonna, and then like Queer as Folk. I didn't see any representations of myself and what it meant to be, a full-fledged, fortified like gay Black man. I had to dig for that. I had to dig and actually like do the work. And of course, like you look in the history books and you dig enough and you find like Bayard Rustin. You dig in the media, you find things like Queer as Folk. Like they're there, but those are not the things that are generally easily accessible. And I think that also has an impact on the way that, people access gayness,
Like if you don't see those icons for people to reach out to or to look into, it's difficult to really navigate your way through a community. And like right now, I feel like it's at a point of like why Black and queer are tired is like you're talking about this for me at least, you're talking about our existence and how they conflict and how you're asking for the world to accept us or as the humans that we are, while you're also seeing that conflict within the LGBTQ community with us being Black. So you're watching the two communities that you identify with, you were a part of, and having these conversations is hard. It's hard, but they need to be had. So
yeah, and it seems like the issue has finally been forced, and it needs to be forced because doing it politely and asking for the conversation to happen was not working at all. So I want to actually go to the third question because I do see that we're getting a couple of questions for people, which was so the article very much was about how can you celebrate Pride if you're tired, frankly, and you're worn out, the author suggested a few things. You can go to Pride, maybe you sit it out, maybe you do some more online stuff, maybe you engage in conversations. But I'd love to hear from the two of you because I think we ask a lot of people. Seychelle, you just said it. We are debating people's lives on a regular basis, on a mass scale, with military level armament going on at the same time, which should not be happening. Let's be super clear on that. So for the two of you who are both part of this conversation and part of the communities, what do you think what should we be suggesting to people to do? What kind of options should be out there for celebrating Pride in a year when, frankly, it's really hard to want to party given what's happening all around us?
So one thing for me that's really important is I think folks really need to take a deep look at the way that my brain files it's space or like the use of space. So if you are going to have a Pride celebration in whatever iteration that you're going to do it in, like, is this space accessible to Black people? Are you employing Black people to work the event? Are you hiring Black acts? Are you uplifting Black music? Like we talked about this last week. We have our divas and we have those media things that we all know and love, but like, sometimes that's not the best landscape if you want to include Black people. Like, I just think there needs to be more intentionality and a more critical look at how we create, pride. Maybe it's not the best idea to have, Metropolitan Police at your Pride celebration, like things of that nature. I think there needs to be a critical look at.
And Sashelle, what do you think?
A lot. It's great to echo a lot of what Jamel said, and it's great to show up during Pride Month and build those relationships, but it needs to continue besides Pride, and continuing to support that shows real support, real allyship. I've really been witnessing a lot of performative allyship lately, and like, to me, allyship or activism rooted in shame doesn't have the longevity that this movement needs, and the support that it needs. And I feel like a lot of people are taking, from the conversations that I'm having with people, they're looking at the situation of like, what can I do now? Like big, and it can do smaller items. We're talking about educating ourselves and having these conversations. Making sure you're prepared to have the conversations. These conversations are uncomfortable, they're uneasy, it's a lot. And depending on who you're talking to, you may lose someone if you're not educated enough and you don't know what you're talking about, or you're spreading misinformation, which is also harmful. So like, taking the time to really understand what you're talking about and having those conversations and educating.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to ask Liz if she might be able to pop back in, because I've been sort of watching. I've been listening to you, but also watching. We've got a bunch of questions for people, so I'd love to bring some of those in. Liz, can you help us with that?
Yeah, hi, I'd be happy to. So we have a number of comments that came up earlier, particularly talking about someone thanking us. Here's Luis. Talking about Dr. Crenshaw in relation to intersectionality, and a lot of people who are not even mentioning her name when she's the person coined the phrase, like, to something about the idea of not even giving credit where it's due, and all these people are having conversations about it, around it, but not actually mentioning the name of the person who coined the phrase. And also sharing the earlier conversation around power structures and how, Jamel, you raised that wasn't really where the article went, where it's really a critical part of that conversation. So we do have some questions that came up later, the problem being there are so many really good questions here. So I'm gonna bring this one up about how to decide when it's worth energy or risk to bring your whole self into a space. That's a
good question. Man, that's tough to answer. So I think it really depends on like my personal level of investment in any given relationship or any given space. Like, if it's important for me, or if I value that particular person or space, like, I'm going to try my best to bring my full self and to bring all parts of me all of the time. I also have to feel safe. I think safety is a really big part of it. Like, if I begin to share these aspects of myself, is this person going to still love and care about me? Am I in physical harm or danger? These are things that you have to consider. It sucks, but it's kind of just a part of being a queer man of color,
And it's you really are weighing the pros and cons of, like, is it worth it? I recently had an incident with a good friend who, or a former friend at this point, really expressing like where I stand on these matters, and just trying to clear up some confusion, and provided resources and the help, and even offered to do the education myself in some type of aspect. And instead of meeting me there, they decided to terminate friendship after 17 years. So I brought my whole self, and it was not welcomed. On the flip side of that, you also need to assess, like, that's emotional, like, harm, or emotion has an emotional toll. Also looking at the physical toll that it could potentially have. I'm always assessing if it's worth it. If adding my Blackness or my queerness to the situation is needed, it will be there, such as the conversation that we had with that friend. I needed to express and defend and explain for my community and for me as a person. And it had not the greatest effect in that moment. But other times there's beautiful moments where your perspective is needed. And if I see that in that moment it is needed and it's going to be valued and it's not going to be dismissed, bring it, do it. At the end of the day, it's about preserving you, because if you're harmed and you're hurt, you can't go on. You can't continue to do the work. So I don't think it's ever a really bad time to assess what's best for you, but looking at it.
I just need to raise the point that it's absolutely preposterous that we even need to have a conversation about assessing which identity is allowed to be salient or safe to be salient at any given moment in our lives. It is absolutely preposterous that we need to have this discussion, and that we are having this discussion. And even worse, that there are lots of people who don't even know that this actually happens every single day.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to do better, especially inside of the LGBTQ space. We got a lot of work to do. I'm getting off my soapbox. Liz, because she's probably
allow me to help you down with a really salient comment that went towards our last question about pride, right? About, talking about pride spaces, encouraging queer people of color to be the keynote, not the extra tent at pride events, which heard, I think. And so we had a follow-up question to that. And, I think, your personal opinions on what spaces do the best job of being welcoming to Black LGBTQ plus people. Do you have favorites, places that you have felt welcomed, or? And the answer might be none, or I don't have an example. In itself, an answer.
I think that's a good question. Aside from spaces that I have cultivated myself and been able to build and establish and tie myself to, I think most spaces at best are a work in progress. At the best, that things are not perfect and that's okay, but you're trying to do something. But I feel like I'm constantly thinking about how my gayness or my Blackness factors into me being in a space. I was just reading an article about the barbershop and the hair salon, being a gay Black man in a barbershop. If you know anything about Black barbershops, they're a very masculine space, and they frequently have some topics that are discussed that are not always the safest conversations for me to chime into. So I shut up and I kind of go in, I get the service done, and I leave. It's stuff like that. You just learn to exist and to make a value judgment about whether or not it's safe and okay to participate.
I would say the best places that I feel welcomed to be my entire self, I don't notice until after the fact. You notice right away. You notice right away when you're uncomfortable, discomfort, or something's off, the improvements, you can rattle it off. But you find your time in these places where they exist, where you're I notice after the fact, or I start bringing in new people, other people of the community. That's when I know that I'm comfortable, because I'm not going to add someone to something that I don't even want to be to. So.
What a fascinating answer. It's the absence of a bad experience that sort of defines what inclusive looks like. But I think it's true. I mean, when you have that seamless feeling of belonging,
that's great, and more, I didn't hate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it looks like, Liz, we are unfortunately just about out of time.
We have 1 minute, so I'm going to get myself out of here so you can say goodbye.
Jamel and Seychelle, thank you so much for being with us this week, and thank you for doing this and saying yes to me again when I come groveling. Will you come and talk to us again? I appreciate you both, and I hope you both have a fabulous rest of your Pride Month in whatever form it's actually going to take. So thank you. And for everybody out there, I want to thank you again for joining us. This is a conversation that we're just starting, and we're going to keep having, and we're going to have more like that here. So I hope that you'll be back. We will be back again next Thursday, same bat time, same bat channel. to have more conversations. We're really excited that you've been here. Once again, my name is Jean Marie Navetta, and I work for PFLAG. We are at pflag.org, and I hope that you'll go learn a little bit more about us today. And as we close up every single week in the works of the doctor, run fast, laugh hard, and be kind. And please, most of all, be kind. We will see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us.